Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the new Rebel Clash stuff, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be rounding out the Ultra Prism to Sword and Shield format by looking at the Limitless Online Series, the second qualifier. Now there was 940 players entering into this one. Bear in mind it is a free-to-enter PTCGO tournament, so sometimes there are slightly different player base to what you'd normally expect. Physically going to tournaments, not necessarily a bad thing, it's just slightly different. Best of one series where deck lists are open, so all of these things may have minuscule factors into what ended up achieving success, but ultimately all of these decks at the top ended up on very, very respectable records with way more wins than losses, sometimes just like 2 or 3 losses throughout, a couple days of tournament play, which is just absolutely incredible. And we saw some really interesting results, quite varied from the first qualifier, so clearly it shows that the game is quite reactive. There's normally a decent amount of people jumping over onto different decks, and there was certainly a different picture in this second qualifier from the first one. I think I'm actually going to start off, before jumping into the list, looking at the top 111 from the second qualifier, and we can actually compare it to the first qualifier, because I actually think it's a really interesting little bit of information to look at. You can see ADPization still quite dominant overall. Mewtwo Malamar had a huge uptick in this tournament. It seemed to be a much safer deck going into this tournament, where with Big Charm and Swell, you naturally had a decent time against ADPization, and you had the Stinger combo to actually help against Mill, which greatly overperformed in many players' eyes in the first qualifier. So the knee-jerk reaction then became, let's add Nightwatch Marnie Disruption to Mill, and also have Stinger as a combo, Stinger into the Baby Blown, to then deal with the control decks very easily. So Mewtwo ended up in a better meta position. Mewtwo's kind of been wrestling throughout this entire format of which variant is the most dominant. We've seen Welder, we've seen Malamar, and we've seen Ultimate Mewtwo all be relatively successful at different points, but the Mewtwo Mally was the one that ended up being the most powerful in this tournament. ADP Spiritomb, as we saw from Ross Cawthon as the Rogue, picked up a lot of popularity. I think it's not that unrealistic to think that this is like the budget way of playing ADP as well. If you can't get your hands on 3 to 4 Zacians, it's much easier to get your hands onto Spiritombs. So it does, again, lean into the free aspect of this tournament. Many people will be able to access Spiritombs on PTCGO that may not have the chance to get their Zacians just yet. Mill didn't completely disappear, still did quite well. 8 of them in that top 100 or so, which is pretty decent. Also, some Magcargo Mill also did well, just 3 of those. But it was one of those decks that was very hyped from the previous qualifier. Pikarom, Baby Blowns, Magcargo, which didn't see, I don't think, any play in the first qualifier's day 2 entrance, but there was 5 of them this time around. One was our own Benji Pham from CCG. He played a Lowland Persian GX in his list as well. We might have a quick look at that after we've gone over the top 8. Firebox obviously made top 8 last qualifier, and a handful of them were played this time around. Beheeyem, Luke Metal, Mewtwo Toolbox, Ultimate Mewtwo, and then in the other section there was some Frostmoth Lapras. Do bear in mind Robin Schultz was playing Lapras in, I think it was the Fader Town Invitational or one of those invitational tournaments, so it might have been some people seeing that success, or at least seeing that gameplay through a top player and wanting to pick it up themselves. Gramble, of course, had that top 16 finish last qualifier, and also there were some Brilliant players that also made it into the top 114. If you haven't checked out the CCG Facebook page, we do plenty of posts about this stuff. We had lots of stats. These are our players from who made day 2 from the first qualifier. Benji and Bert both made day 2 in the second qualifier as well. So if we just compare graphs, ADPization was still like almost as dominant as it was both times around, but you can see there was a definite reaction. Cincino was much more targeted in the second tournament. Baby Blowns was far less powerful, and there's a little bit more streamlined. There was a lot more like random kind of roguey variants in the first qualifier. Obviously there was more physical decks in general, but it seemed a bit more streamlined in the second qualifier, and Malamar did notably worse. It just was a lot more Mewtwo Malamar variants that succeeded. So that's the overall meta in day 2. But let's jump into the top 8 deck lists in particular. And Masato Shimada from Japan, I want to say. Probably scuffed the pronunciation, I do apologize. But he was piloting a Welder box list. And normally you'd call it Ability Zard, but this is just Welder and friends, really. Not playing any tag teams, just a bunch of 2-prize Pokemon. It kind of reminds me of a mishmash of the Baby Blounds engine as well as the Ability Zard, because you've got that Oricorio GX in here as well to give yourself a bit of help against stamp proofing and just more draw in general when, you know, these 2 prizes are getting knocked out rather than 3 prizes. Now, it does put you under a lot more pressure against ADPization because you don't have anything that can possibly hope to tank, whereas sometimes at least the Charizard can sit there and, you know, force the opponent to at least find, you know, Shrine, Vitality Band, that sort of stuff. But no, just going for the pure 2-prize and 1-prize approach with the Victini Prism Star was enough here. We saw that Kevin did pretty well with Welder the previous week. Now we've seen a couple of different iterations. Once again, we saw the Poker Gear in both players' lists that were successful this week and the previous qualifier. One thing we see in this list is Lysander Labs as a stadium, to be a 4th count of stadium. I know Kevin played the 3 stadium counts, double Flint and Marshadow. Here we're seeing 1 Labs. It can obviously help out against Zacian players by turning off their frying pans, which can be very good for you. Also playing a reset stamp, and this is something that for me feels kind of rare in Ability Zard decks. Normally it's one of those things that gets thrown away half of the games you play. But some of the games, you know, it can be a saving grace for you, and I'm sure it came into good effect at some points in the game. But yeah, just a more Heatran-focused Welder-based list being successful. Not too surprising, because that 190 hit points is annoying for ADP a lot of the time. To GX and then hit into you for 180. They need help from Shrine and such. Or Vitality Band on their own end, so that 190 is sometimes annoying with the Heatran, and obviously Steaming Stomp into that Hot Burn is sometimes just very, very good pressure for you. So yeah, Welder doing really, really well over the last couple of qualifiers. I think Zard wasn't super played in the regional events, but you can see in the Limitless Qualifiers it's done so well. Another in top 4 as well as the 1st place finish, so going super deep into the tournament. Avi Lashan was able to come 2nd with a Mewtwo Malamar. Like I said, there was a decent number in the top 32 of the 1st qualifier, and I think a number of people took that as a good opportunity to jump on the bandwagon. You can see it's rocking the Big Charm Swell combo. Just the 1 Big Charm, but still is a decent option in here. And the shell is very similar. It's got the Stinger, obvious reasoning there. It's got the Latios, again, just 2 great GX attacks in the format right now. Horror House is still insane, and Photon Geyser is your big burst of damage output. And yeah, it's just very vanilla. It's kind of like going back in time to the start of this format, back in the IC, where people were just rocking lists very, very similar to this, to be honest. And yeah, it's one of those things where it got discredited after the initial results, and it's taken a little while to sort of warm up to the format, but it's ended up like in a decent meta placement and got a 2nd place, which is very, very respectable. In a 3rd place, we have Taketo, and he is playing Cincino Control. Yes, it was more targeted. I'm sure there were more people playing energy switches this tournament. There were more people adding in additional Marnies. There were more people doing all sorts of things. Orangaru's coming in. Obviously, Orangaru was in the ADP lists from the previous week, as well as E-Switch. So it was a slightly riskier player going into this tournament, but it still proved that it's got the goods here. And again, it's just like standard stuff going on, really. There's not too much surprising here. And interestingly, it's also another day 2 player played the exact same 60. So yeah, just a pretty cookie cutter list, really, and just good play overall, getting them through the rounds. There's nothing too much to speak of here. It's not playing the Team Yell Grunts, it's just going for the Crushing Hammers, a Giraffe Rig, potentially a nice card to help out against Stinger, but that's really about it. Playing no Yell Grunts is interesting, because I guess as soon as people put in the energy switches, you just like kind of take out the Yell Grunts because they don't really do the same job you would want them to, so kind of makes sense to devote those spaces to other things. Next up we have Pavel, and he is playing the other ability Zard list. This time it is playing the Zard. It is playing a couple more of the 1 prizes that we'd expect, like the Turtonator and the Volk, and it is also playing that Marshadow. So a bit more close to what we saw from Kevin last time. This time it's not playing any of the poker gears. Instead, I think it's just playing more tech Pokemon, really, is the only real change I can see here. But yeah, just, again, Zard doing the work a lot of the time. What I think is really interesting about Ability Zard is that a lot of people move towards Marnie rather than Stamp in this meta, just to help deal with Mill and other stuff like that, and Baby Blounds most of the time. And I think Ability Zard low-key kind of profited from that, because being given like a 5-card hand and then Stellar Wish a lot of the time is just like super fine for you as Zard. So I think it's not a surprise really that Zard's performed better as Stamp has decreased and Marnie's increased. It's just like not as disruptive. You normally still have a decent push to like go for game a lot of the time with this list. So it's not a huge surprise to see Zard do so well. Just in the fallout of all this disruption changing up. Alex was able to place pretty well with ADP-zation. Once again, rocking the Guru Feeny kind of stuff, very similar to what we saw in the successful list from the first qualifier. It's gone for coin flip catchers as well as resource management. So we saw coin flip catchers in one of the Gus Haller builds, I want to say, from the first qualifier, and that proved to be pretty good. But now we're seeing spinners without acrobikes. Instead, it's got spaces for the E-switches. So, and also it's got the higher Marnie count than the research. Again, this blows my mind that Marnie's ended up being a higher count a lot of the time, or an equal count to research in a lot of lists, but people are just really valuing that disruption right now in the game to help against some of your dodgier matchups, just make people draw worse. You have Intrepid Sword to fall back on if ever Marnie like makes you draw bad. So yeah, overall ADP finding ways to be successful in all sorts of different variations. This one's playing no Absol for disruption, anything like that, but it's just trying to rely on that Marnie most of the time to give people poor hands and capitalize on Gust with those coin flips as well. Mario was able to get another placement for Mewtwo. Again, this time we're seeing 1 Metal Energy instead of the Auroras. Again, playing Big Charm Swell as an option in the list. This is playing 4 Marnie and 2 Reset Stamps, so that's a lot of hand disruption available. I actually really like the Sinlin in the list. That's something I really liked playing in my Mewtwo. Just to give you extra like fuel in your hand most turns. A lot of the time, because you're like night watching into people like a couple turns in a row, having that Sinlin just to like get your next research for reload or Marnie for hand disruption seems really good. But the Stamp, in addition to Marnie, is something that you rarely see, because a lot of people associate clunk factor with Mewtwo Mally, and you can see that there's like a very thin tag call package in here, just 2 copies of Mewtwo, so you may end up starting with some more dodgy stuff at times, but they've just made that concession so that they can have Stamps in here to go for the full Stamp Night Watch and put people to top deck mode, which is pretty interesting. This one's not playing the Absol, instead it's just playing a slightly like altered engine of attackers. It's got the Solgaleo Lunala in here to do the 4 energy attack with Cosmic Burn to get through Zacians, so potential just a little bit cheaper to get your way through them, which is interesting, and keep your energy on board to threaten other attacks later on. But that's really about it. Like I said, I think Charm Swell definitely like grew into the format. It was something I was noting in the previous tournament that there might be a bit of an uptick. We've seen Shintaro, a previous Worlds winner and 2nd place finisher. He has made top 8 with Magcargo Mill. Again, it was one of those archetypes that did pretty well in the previous qualifier, a couple in top 8. And we're seeing that the Fluffy Pillow combination is still powerful. Again, it looks like Shintaro has dropped most of the energy disruption stuff. None of the Yarl Grunts made it in here. Just going for aggro Belelba kind of stuff with the Sleepy Pillow to fall back on to protect yourself. And that's really about it. Just trying to do the normal resource management Belelba stuff. So yeah, the Magcargo, again, one of those ones that was slow to really kick off thanks to like a relatively poor OCIC finish. Where Cincino like kind of trumped it, and then it took a while for it to pick back up in popularity. Finally, we have Takahiko, who was also playing Mewtwo Malamar. So 3 Mewtwo Mallies in top 8. That's absolutely insane. And only 1 ADP-zation. Very different from that. But one thing it does indicate, with the 24% of ADP that made day 2, 3 Mewtwo Malamars making it all the way to top 8 and higher, means that it probably battled its way through other ADPizations and had a pretty positive time against it. Here we're seeing just the 4 mana, the 4 research, and Poker Gears helping out for extra consistency. I really like the high ball search of this list. I like the Absol as well, I think, most of the time, because really, a lot of the time, with your tankiness, you just need like 1 Malamar in play sometimes to do like setup attachments for the bench, as long as you don't whiff early game attachments, so... Or like you can push towards that second Malamar a good amount of times, but it's not like mandatory to go much further than that. This one isn't playing the Stinger, so it may feel a little bit worse against control. You're just trying to lean into that Night Watch as much as possible. Maybe try and yeah, just make the most out of that a lot of the time. That's really all I can say on that front. So it's a bit more streamlined than some of these other ones, a lot less tech focused and just trying to get the job done with the core attacks, which is Horror House and Night Watch most of the time. Also, the Pale Moon GX shouldn't be slept on. So yeah, interesting stuff all around from these Mewtwo Mallies. Far more successful than we expected. There were a few other interesting things in the top 16, and then like Ross Cawthon getting 9th place with ADP Tomb. So man, the consistency of Ross is super insane. Like, it feels like he doesn't play in enough tournaments to really demonstrate how strong of a player he truly is. But man, he's been crushing these 2 invitationals. Did he even make a change from his last list? It doesn't look like many changes in here at all, to be honest. Yeah, I can't note any big changes from his previous list. Looks very similar. Maybe 1 or 2 cards off. Oh no, it is the same. It's the exact same list. It's the same as Qualifier 1. So yeah, same 60. No changes required. Just locked it in again and got a 9th. Like, that's super insane. We see a lot more Mewtwo Mallies, like a bunch of them in top 16. Baby Blounce did still make a top 16. Pedro played an interesting Zacian control. Not really Belelba based, more just trying to run you out of stuff with the Luke Metal, scoop ups to undo damage, and rather than using crushing hammers to get rid of energies, you just attack people to get rid of energies, but it's like a slow grind really, which is pretty interesting. And it's got Persian to disrupt mill players, which is pretty cool. More ADPization. Pikarom, the highest finisher, was 19th place with Owen Kammerman. Not much else going on in top 32, just a couple Pikaroms really rounding it out, and a handful of other Mewtwo variants, and a few Zacians in there as well. So yeah, take a look at some of these lists if you want to, but that will round out this format. The next 2 qualifiers, number 3 and number 4, are going to be Rebel Clash legal, so that'll be interesting. It's a really nice way to round out the format. I think it's almost as if it was left unsolved just because of the lack of tournaments that we did end up having. Obviously, we missed out on the EUIC, so it would have been interesting to see how that played out overall, but I think it's not too unreasonable, the decks that ended up coming out on top. The mill was good, like, from the start. Mewtwo Malamar kind of like was a slow burn, but eventually found itself in a good meta placement. Abilitizard was just kind of there, and when you draw good with Welder decks, you still make your way through. ADPization was always a presence in the game, but people found ways of countering it, be it Yell Grunts and then all sorts of other stuff. I think one of the reasons potentially why a lot of these Zacians ended up like lower down was because you're having to commit spaces towards energy switches and cutting some of the nice cards like Acrobike that actually like get you in the game some of the time. So it's almost like ADP lists had to get so greedy to keep up with the techs that they ended up like being a bit clunkier than they initially were earlier on in the season. So yeah, that's just a natural flow of like being the number 1 deck. You end up getting targeted out a little bit. Even if you stay competitive and can end up with really good day 1 records, you do end up getting caught in the crossfire by a few other things. Maybe a bad matchup here and there, like ADP Tomb picking up in play can sometimes hurt you. Stuff like that is still certainly a thing. So yeah, that does close the book on the Ultra Prism Sword and Shield format. Let me know your thoughts. How did you finish in this tournament? I didn't end up playing in this one. I just needed the weekend off, really. I've been doing a bunch of Rebel Clash stuff, and I hope you're all enjoying that. I'll be going back to Rebel Clash stuff tomorrow, so keep an eye out for some new decks. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.